Hey guys, it's Jason, the lead safety and technical trainer with Tyndale. Welcome back for another installment of 70E Made Easy. Today we're going to talk about one of the most important steps to keep you safe, which is Article 130.4 E and F. This is the electrical shock approach boundaries, and it is one of the most misunderstood topics in the 70E. Last time we covered A through D. In this episode, we're going to cover E and F, which describes your shock protection boundary, known as the limited approach boundary. Let's go to 130.4E. It says the electric shock boundaries identified as limited approach boundary and restricted approach boundary shall be applicable where personnel are approaching exposed energized electrical conductors or circuit parts. Then it goes on to tell us about the two tables used to figure out these distances. For this episode, I'm going to focus on 130.4EA, which is the table for AC voltages. 130.4EB is for your DC voltages and is very important these days with EV, PV, and battery storage at the forefront of everything. So to sum up 130.4E, there's going to be two shock boundaries. One is for the unqualified person, so they can't reach into your work area and contact energized parts. And the restricted shock boundary is closer to the hazard, those energized parts, and is for the qualified worker. That's so they'll understand when to initiate safe work practices such as tools, PPE, energized work permits, etc. Let's look at the table for a specific example. Typically, you're going to be focused on column number 3, which will be your limited approach boundaries to expose fixed parts. For most of you, you're going to be working on electrical equipment that's below 750 volts. So you can see that your boundary is going to be 3'6" or 42 inches, whichever you're most comfortable with. As your voltage increases, you can see your boundary increases as well. Let's get into more detail about 130.4F1, which is the limited approach boundary when approached by unqualified persons. The text tells us that unless permitted by 130.4F3, no unqualified person shall be permitted to approach nearer than that limited approach boundary of energized conductors or circuit parts. The reason for this is that unqualified people are not trained to identify the hazards and reduce the associated risk, as the definition states in Article 100. So what happens when an unqualified person is working at or close to your boundary? Well, let's look at the text again in 130.4F2. It tells us that when one or more unqualified people are working at or close to that limited approach boundary, there's some alerting methods that are needed, and those are described in 130.8O, the letter O. Those shall be applied to warn the unqualified people of the electrical hazards and to stay outside of that limited approach boundary. So to be clear, boundaries are imaginary lines, right? You don't have a clue when you cross a state line unless there's a physical sign or something, right? This is going to be a physical barricade that we're talking about. So basically, the text is telling us that whenever you have unqualified people working around you, you need to have something tangible that they can see and touch, right? Something physical that will stop them from entering your work area. We're going to talk later about those again in 130.8O and the types of barricades that should and should not be used. There are going to be situations where you have someone that is unqualified and they need to enter or pass through your work area. It should be rare. You should always eliminate that risk, but occasionally there might be that risk. So it addresses that in 130.4F3. It tells us that when there is a need for an unqualified person to cross the limited approach boundary, you as a qualified person shall advise that unqualified person of the possible hazards, and then you have to continuously escort them while inside of that limited approach boundary, that space. Under no circumstances shall that unqualified person ever be permitted to cross that restricted approach boundary. That's going to be that 12-inch boundary typically. So basically, it's like holding your kid's hand across the street, right, to make sure that they don't touch anything. So that pretty much sums up the limited approach boundary. We're going to see you next time for 130.4G, which is the restricted approach boundary. Thanks for watching, and make sure you're staying safe out there.